Economic growth won't dig U.S. out of this hole. People are worried that the global financial crisis, combined with the Great Recession in the United States, has bankrupted not just ourselves, but our kids and their kids for generations to come. First, here's the good news for those of us who live in the United States. If you live in some other den of fiscal inequity, just remember that the names of the characters may be different, but the story is pretty much the same. The federal budget deficit for fiscal 2010, including a proposed $100 billion in new spending to create jobs, is expected to hit $1.6 trillion. This would beat the record set in the distant past of fiscal 2009 by $150 billion and be equivalent to 11% of U.S. gross domestic product. For reference, the budget deficit that has pushed Greece into crisis is equal to 12.7% of Greek GDP. So, in other words, the crisis level is getting closer. And how can this possibly be good news? Because the new budget proposed by the Obama administration for fiscal 2011, which starts in October 2010, says the annual deficit will shrink to 4% of GDP by fiscal 2014. And now for the bad news. It isn't going to happen. At least not if we follow the spending and taxing policies laid out in the administration's budget. That budget assumes 2.7% GDP growth in fiscal 2010. That sounds reasonable. It's certainly close to the consensus among economists for this year. But looking out toward fiscal 2014, the budget quickly arrives in Fantasyland. The budget projections assume GDP growth of 3.2% to 4.3% for 6 consecutive years. And this comes at a time when most economists, even the optimists at the Federal Reserve, are worried that this recovery will be weaker than most recoveries after recessions, and that the long-term speed limit for growth in the U.S. economy is headed lower. From 1975 to 1995, full-trend economic growth in the United States was approximately 3%. The Fed now estimates the speed limit to growth at 2.5%. Other economists, including those at the Congressional Budget Office, think it's even lower, 2.3% annually or so. In other words, the U.S. can't grow itself out of this hole nearly as easily as the Obama administration wishes. So, more wishful thinking. And the bad news. Slower growth after the recession is one thing arguing against an easy solution, but it's by no means the only thing. The interest rate the U.S. pays on its debt is rising, just when the amount of debt has soared. Cutting the budget looks impossible because our government, especially our wonderful Senate, is gridlocked. It's hard to imagine how the Senate will pass any kind of budget this year. Even in the best of political worlds, cutting the budget is hard. Only 40% or so of the federal budget is what's called discretionary, and that 40% includes the military budget. The rest consists of entitlements such as Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. These entitlements are the hardest parts of the budget to cut, and, of course, the fastest growing. And we don't have a huge window in which to act. Add to all this the $1 trillion or more spent on the wars, and you see how this will be a huge challenge. A slower economic growth rate caused by high debt levels makes it even harder to grow your way out of the hole. Under the current trend, the United States will show a debt to GDP ratio above 100% by 2012. And then, of course, there's a long-term demographic trend. The United States is an aging country, but we're not aging as quickly as most of the developed world, or even as fast as some parts of the developing world, such as China. But aging relatively slowly doesn't help in this situation. A country that is aging in absolute terms is getting older and can look forward to a slower rate of economic growth. And if all this makes the situation sound depressingly grave, there's even worse news. The world's traditional fix for this kind of debt problem, when it's the result of a few years of financial mismanagement, doesn't work very well when we're looking at a deeper and chronic problem shared by many of the world's countries or economies. The traditional solution, the IMF solution, the formula is one of the International Monetary Funds, has applied to developing countries for decades, like in the plan proposed by the Greek government to end its financial crisis. To get the annual deficit down from 12.7% of GDP to 3% by 2012, the government has proposed cutting wages for all public sector jobs, cutting public sector wages in the private sector, raising taxes, and cutting entitlement payments. Aside from the high level of pain in such a solution, it's not clear that the IMF formula can work when applied across the global economy. The plan really boils down to cutting wages so that the economy can theoretically export its way out of debt, while at the same time reducing the growth rate of that debt by cutting spending. The entire globe or world growing its way out of debt by cutting wages and exporting more runs into a major problem. Where are the buyers if wages are down across the world? What world currencies are worth? All the U.S. would have to do to start down the path toward reducing its deficits and the debt to GDP burden would be to raise taxes to 35% of GDP, freeze Social Security payments at current levels, and cut spending across the board. That means everything. That might be less painful in the short run, but it's very hard to see how that a tax hike wouldn't reduce economic growth. You're talking about taking money out of the economy to pay down debt. And if cutting spending in the United States were that easy, of course, we wouldn't be in the hole that we're in. Unfortunately, even if we're measuring productivity accurately, and it's not clear we are, productivity alone cannot save the economy. In the short run, though, probably the biggest help would be credible fiscal leadership. International investors in the bond markets need to be convinced that the U.S. is serious about fixing this problem and that it has a credible plan to do so. But there is no hopeful sign that enough politicians in Washington will put aside their short-term goals for the 2010 elections long enough to come up with a budget plan. After all, the Senate couldn't even pass a proposal to set up a commission to recommend cuts that wouldn't go into effect until fiscal 2012. So, again, in other words, this time it's different. There are fundamental problems with the U.S. economy and with the economies of the whole world. Real change must happen, and it must happen for the better. The time has come, and these are more signs of the end times. Transition days. The transition is an ongoing, continuing process. And of course, there are many signs.